Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It's Thursday, January 11th, 2024 at 10:17 in the morning. So we're here now to look at the Workforce Development Governance Report. And so we have with us this morning Alicia Ordway, who is the senior consultant with Public Consulting Group, who's been working with the SOCWED for the last a little bit over a year now. We also have members of the SOCWED that have joined us. I think the only one that's missing is Senator Clarkson, and she's having to run her committee because of illness. The chair of Senate Economic Development is on the sick side right now, so she won't be joining us. But before we get started with Alicia, I think I'll introduce the committee to you so that you know who's here. So Stephanie, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stephanie Jerome, and I'm the vice chair. I represent the town of Brandon.
Good morning. I'm Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanek. I represent a portion of Burlington.
I'm Representative Kirk White, and I represent Bethel, Stockbridge, Rochester, and Hancock.
And I'm Heather Chase, and I represent Chester, Athens, Grafton, and Wyndham.
Good morning. I'm Representative Jared Samus. I represent Castle.
Hi, Edie Granning, representing Jericho and Underhill.
So I'm Mike Marcotte, Chair, House Commerce and Economic Development, but I am also chair of the SOCWED as well, member of the task force. So we do have two members. We have one other member here. Kendall, would you like to introduce?
Good morning, Kendall Smith, Governor Scott's Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs.
And two other members of the SOCWED are with us virtually. Jay?
Good morning, Jay Ramsey. I'm the Director of Workforce Development at the Vermont Department of Labor.
Adam?
Good morning, everyone. Adam Grenold. I'm the Executive Director at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, Chair of the statewide board and member of SOCWED.
Okay. So Alicia, thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to going through the report with you, and we'll see what kind of questions that might generate with the committee. So leave it to you now.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Representative Marcotte, and it's a pleasure to meet all of you today. I am going to hopefully successfully screen share. Let's see. Okay. Everyone can see the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. So thank you for the opportunity to work on this really exciting project here in Vermont. Before we get into too much of the details of the report, I just want to highlight for the committee, whoops, I hit the wrong key, just kidding, that the product that we're going to discuss today is a result of a series of stakeholder interviews and review of existing documents, multiple discussions that we've had with the SOCWED around other state models and elements that seemed most worthy for consideration and as Vermont moves forward with new models. And there's been a back and forth around what makes sense and what doesn't. This report is a product of a team of national experts pulled from ICF, a global consulting firm, expertise within Public Consulting Group, and also a representative from the National Association of Workforce Boards. So as we sought to develop some recommendations for this committee, we received feedback from, obviously, from the RFP that we responded to, as well as feedback from the SOCWED and stakeholders throughout Vermont that we engaged with. And whatever we ended up proposing, we wanted to ensure that the governance structure was built on these four pillars, that the model would make more explicit accountability and oversight and the authority within the system. And the system would be, I think, fair to say, pretty generously defined as not just the federal Department of Labor investments, but also looking holistically at workforce development resources interwoven in other federal investments, as well as contributions made by the state that went out for bid perhaps, or philanthropic contributions as well that are interacting alongside these public investments to create the ecosystem. The structure, we sought to create a structure that comprehensively would allow for some data alignment, which would be key to understanding the return on investment for all of these investments. We were looking for a structure that would promote greater resource integration. And again, always, this is all built on meeting the needs of residents of Vermont, both current and future, as well as the businesses that do that have activity both within Vermont, but also thinking about the importance of regional integration with partners, whether it be New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. And finally, I think we were seeking to develop a governance system that would honor statewide priorities, but also recognize that Vermont is comprised of a very differentiated set of regions. And how would we create a government? One of the key questions we were considering is how do we create a governance structure that enabled both of those things to be true at the same time? So what you have in the final report is a series of models. The first model is a reimagined statewide workforce development board. There are opportunities to make a slew of changes that would really reposition the statewide workforce board and create some real traction for the residents and businesses of Vermont. The second model is the State Workforce Expansion and Development Board. This one focused a bit more on repositioning, rebranding, elevating the statewide workforce board with a real focus on as an independent entity that would serve to coordinate and connect and convene across stakeholders in the ecosystem that I mentioned before. Model 3 is one, and I will go through all of these in more detail, but Model 3 is one that we sought to think about the importance of, if you're going to have governance over a system, you need to know more about what it is that you're governing. And throughout a number of stakeholder interviews in the spring, we heard some challenges around having data capacity across a wide range of organizations and system interoperability so that people could actually truly understand and get a holistic picture of what was happening as a result of these investments. And so Model 3, well, some could argue is a tool for perhaps Model 1 or 2. It also could be that with any good data system, you need governance. And the governance system would require very similar stakeholders. And so we offer that as a third option that could be both, again, integrated in other models, but could also be a starting point and a standalone model to begin activity. So what I'm going to do now is go through each of these models, share a little bit about the features, the pros and cons, and some of the implementation needs in order to enact some of these models. Within each of these models, we are also seeking just some things to keep in mind, that some of the design principles that we heard back from the SOCWED was an emphasis on thinking about simplicity, efficiency, nimbleness, and responsibility, but with clearly articulated authority, and that whatever the SOCWED ended up with, the form should always follow the function. Okay, so here we have Model 1. I'm going to go into this in more detail, but I just wanted to pull out the image for you and to highlight it so that you could see. Those entities in dark blue represent existing government agencies. The royal blue represents a new office. The, I guess, cream color, if you can see it, is organizations that are external to the state government. And then there's a series of lines to highlight where there would be coordination versus accountability versus a direct reporting structure. So in this model, it's slightly different from the current state in that The executive director of the statewide workforce development board is called out as a standalone office. There'd be an executive director who would be embedded within the Department of Labor, but would have a reporting line into the governor. They would be tasked with coordinating with community partners and regional teams that would implement activity in the regions, but also thinking about some of that cross-cutting coordination across investments, whether from different agencies. Oops, there's a typo here. Let's see. Okay, so so some further features that I just want to highlight here. One of the things that when we did our national scan, that was a best practice that we thought could be easily implemented, was to have an executive director who was that single point of contact for implementing the statewide strategic plan. And as part of that, elevating and making recommendations that represented both the interests of the state government, but also partners externally, to provide feedback on where systems and infrastructure were working well, and perhaps where there would need to be further investment or refinement. And so this could be a key function of these in this model, where the statewide workforce development board is really providing a biannual report that provides clarity around where the state is as it relates to priorities and identifies additional needs or opportunities. Part of that success, though, would require a reconfigured board. Repeatedly, we heard back from folks that the size of the board was just too unwieldy to effectively, for folks, well, just for maintenance and organizing principles, but also for authentic engagement of that many stakeholders. For one person or even a staff of 2 to manage, it was a lot. And there were opportunities to reduce that size while still remaining in compliance with WIOA. I referenced earlier that this structure would hinge upon creating a number of regional teams. This is not to say that Vermont would go back to the old model. Vermont has a unique position as a single state workforce area, and is not necessarily required to have local workforce development boards. There were efforts in the past to do some regional convening that seemed pretty successful, but weren't necessarily fully funded in order to provide the energy and resources to sustain that kind of effort. In this model, our recommendation was to do a grant-funded program, essentially, to fund a backbone organization that could provide that convening and coordination at the local level and work in partnership with the state Workforce Development Board Executive Director. This would allow the Workforce Board flexibility to make choices, or whether it be around focusing on, say, a particular population and segment of the pipeline, or maybe it's a regional, it's an industry focus that the statewide Workforce Board would like to invest in. And then they could change their program model based on the priorities at that time. So again, trying to think about flexibility here in particular, and honoring the needs of both the state priorities as well as what's happening at the local level. So how would this actually get implemented? What are the steps to doing that? Well, in our report, we recommend that the SOCWED develop draft language for a legislative change. This seemed a real opportunity to create something that would provide continuity across administrations, because this level of system change will take time, as we noted in some of the examples of other states earlier in the report. But with that visibility and clarity, there's established accountability to both the legislature as well as to the governor. Another priority and an important measure for implementing this model is to provide some resources to fund the system. As mentioned earlier, there were efforts previously in Vermont's somewhat recent history to do some regional activity, but many stakeholders expressed a desire to do more of that work regionally, but there just wasn't enough capacity and both human and financial to really actualize some of those aspirations. I think I'll just move to summarize. So under this model, some of the advantages, I think, right off the top is that this is a minimally disruptive model. It really takes a lot of the good things that were in the current system and sets it free, I think, from some of the constraints that might have created challenges in the past, such as, for example, the large workforce board. This also, though, would allow to establish the executive director of the statewide workforce board as a sole position with only the responsibility of coordinating, doing all that coordinating and connecting work, and working with Department of Labor around those WIOA compliance activities. That seemed to be a real opportunity after talking with a lot of folks and looking at other models that could really amplify the effectiveness of the statewide workforce board by having that dedicated and visible staff person on the org chart. One of the challenges, though, is that this model is probably the least transformational, right? It's not going to necessarily position the state to do some of the things that we'll talk about in the other models around further integration with some of the resources across secretariats. But it also, one of the challenges would be around choices around who remains on the board versus who steps down. And it's not necessarily positioning the board to do some of that important work around aligning measures across the agency. And then just finally, whether or not how this might impact customer experience, remains to be seen with this board, with this construct. So I think before I go into model 2, I'll pause here and just see if there are any, questions, or I'm happy to answer them along as we go as well. But any questions about, let me put that back up, about model 1.
Questions, committee? Oh, we're good so far. Thanks, Alicia.
Okay, I'll keep going. All right, so model 2. I think this example really leverages a lot of elements and components of things that we've seen that are successful in other states. I just want to clarify, though, before I get into those details, that you'll note that this, unlike the previous model, this chart has an additional layer of these gray shaded areas. And so what we just wanted to do was show and emphasize that the new activity and the new model, or the new resources that are here in the royal blue, establishing the Vermont Workforce Expansion and Development Board and Executive Committee, as a key component here is that they are the intermediary between the external resources in the workforce development ecosystem and the internal to state government resources. And that while in all state workforce development boards, there is a private sector chair, this one really emphasizes that level of accountability, both internally to the governor and as well to the private sector chair. In part, as this one really here calls out the independence of the office and the emphasis on providing more of that coordination capacity to do that work across investments internally and externally through this very visible new entity. So as you look at the features of this model, it would require dissolving the current workforce board and establishing a new entity with a new name. It would, again, provide a lot of the convening, connecting, and coordinating, but also continue to do what is expressed in the WIOA legislation around the function of a state workforce development board, around oversight and whatnot. Not necessarily doing the regulatory functions, and audits, but that sort of thing, but being that body that approves policy, policy procurements, things like, or the decisions as a result of a procurement. I think what's also exciting about this model is, as expressed in the report, is that this establishes an executive committee that would have responsibility for naming and defining priority metrics for the state and developing proposals to address administrative or technical barriers to that reporting. Again, this is a common theme. Given how precious resources are, really seeking for ways to define the return on investment and understand which levers are effective and making change by really comparing apples to apples, if you will. And so that would be a priority responsibility of that executive committee, to get underneath some of the data and reporting issues and take ownership for that. At the same time, understanding all the data would be key to developing the statewide vision in coordination with all the input from the external partners and the workforce ecosystem, as well as aligning that to the governor's strategic priorities. One of the opportunities that we saw from other states, Indiana in particular, was that with this coordinating effort outside of the individual verticals where federal funding would flow, that this could be a space, a holding space, if you will, for doing coordinated activities across the different federal verticals. And that this is a space that could be take responsibility for innovation and really piloting some of those cross secretariat collaborations to see what kinds of things are effective and then potentially could go to scale. I also want to call out that in this model, it makes a little bit more visible the access that the executive director would have to the governor. And while in the previous model, there's a dotted line, I think for optics, in particular outside of government, the advantage here is that the executive director still has that reporting line into the governor, but it is not through another agency within the government. So as we think about this, what would it require to get to this accomplished? As with the other example, this would still require filing new legislation, but this one would go beyond the scope of just changing the membership definitions by actually creating a new office or a new renaming the workforce board and expanding its mandate a little bit in terms of going beyond some of what's expressed in the WIOA legislation. Additionally, as was with the previous example, this model would require additional funds or perhaps reallocating some of the governor's discretionary WIOA funds to really provide that capacity in order to do all of the work of convening and coordinating all of these different partners, both publicly and privately funded, to make this happen. There'd also, of course, be some effort required to just do the integration with the existing administrative structure. So, there are some pros to this model. I think it really integrates and elevates the workforce and economic growth priorities because they're seen not living within just labor and not living within just economic development, but this is a stand-alone place where these two interests would meet. Again, this model codifies this structure in legislation that would ideally continue over time to allow for that stability, to build trust among all the different partners. Again, it's a platform for unified metrics. I think also what's interesting is it's a one-stop access point for businesses. Obviously, businesses are going to have a range of demands and expectations around what their needs are and how public resources could help meet them. But this is a one-stop access point. And then a business could be referred to education if they want to do really early talent pipeline work, perhaps economic development if they need resources for their incumbent workforce, et cetera, et cetera. I think also going back to one of the priorities that we heard from members of the SOCWED was that the system would really benefit from having a clearly identified single state leader. And this takes, this would establish that leadership role, but also position them to be the leader of the workforce ecosystem, not just the federal investments, which, you know, given all of the interests in growing Vermont's workforce, I mean, this could really be a person who is providing that, who's championing those goals, and creating a big tent and inviting others to be part of that. I think as a result, you know, having the leadership, as I said, creating that tent would also go along with creating a comprehensive brand that could then everyone in the ecosystem could see their work being a part of. I think, though, one of the challenges is, in particular at the beginning, is that you know, finding the right person who is able to build that level of trust with such a wide range of stakeholders, you know, is hard. You know, obviously, talent is an issue for all kinds of businesses, you know, healthcare to manufacturing, and obviously within the public sector as well. And so, you know, finding that right person who is able to execute and bring people along could be a challenge. I think one of the other challenges in this model is that, you know, one thing we heard was that during the 2022 to 23 calendar years, there were a lot of efforts to develop a new strategic plan, and there was a lot of goodwill and energy mobilized through that effort. And I think this again goes back to the next leader is, you know, how do they build on that goodwill and not have people feel like this is a complete and utter restart and lose interest? So, you know, it's not something that can't be overcome. It's just a delicate situation that is a potential risk in utilizing this model. And then I think just lastly, to emphasize that, you know, resources for programmatic implementation are still going to reside in their home agencies. And so how a new leader goes about fostering an enthusiasm for doing these kinds of work will be key to the success. And again, another risk, as I already said. Okay. And any questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Questions about Model 2?
Thank you so much. I have two questions.
Sure.
One of them is you listed as a pro that there's a single leader, but it looks like there's a co-chair system here, a private, internal, and external. Is the single state leader the exec? What are you referring to when you talk about that?
Yep, great point. Thank you. You know, I think the private sector chair is really the voice for all of those entities that are served by a robust system. But I think the person who's doing the day-to-day legwork is really the executive director. They're the person who, under the advisement and in close communication with the private sector chair and the governor's lead, is the person who's saying, hey, I'm here to sort of help be that voice of reconciliation between outside government and internal. And here's what collectively, I'm the messenger on behalf of those two entities. And I've, you know, and that's what, I think, as I mentioned under Model 1, thinking about how to develop annual reports that highlight maybe external interests and contributions and align it with internal, and by internal, I mean internal state government, and sort of identifying and elevating and saying, here's what we're hearing from the external partners, here's what we've got internally, and saying to the legislature and to just the general public, like, here's where we're at. Here's what's going well. Here's what we could use to do even more.
And then Mike.
And also, just to add on to what Alicia just said, is that also, you know, the State Workforce Development Board, which we're changing, there's a proposition to change that name in this chart, also needs that private sector chair for WIOA compliance as well. So they're it's kind of similar to the system we have now. You have an executive director, and you also have that private sector chair. And so I think we're not looking to, this doesn't propose to make that change. It's, they're working together in conjunction, but you have that one person with some staff, hopefully, that will be able to coordinate everything under, you know, not just with the board and the WIOA compliance, but also all the external partners that we have and internal partners.
Yep. Yeah, my other question is this executive committee like another body that we have in government today? And I'm wondering, is it like the State Board of Education? Is it like, you know, do we have some other system that looks like this right now within our government? And I can just put that out there as
Kendall might have.
Jay,
Well, I would just say the executive committee is like the operating committee of the current Workforce Development Board. So it's just a smaller group that meets more frequently to conduct the business of the board.
Go ahead,
I was
Kendall.
gonna say what also comes to mind for me when I think about this is it's not exactly the same, but kind of like Building Bright Futures does for the childcare space and early childhood space in terms of being that convener and facilitator of both internal to state government and external early childhood partners, and providing data and information and recommendations. That is, again, it's not an exact apples to apples, but when I think about this model that PCG is recommending, that is kind of what comes to mind for me as the most other similar comparable entity.
so something new, not something we've had ongoing or have a track record of success with, right? Like if you're like Building Bright Futures is new, right? In the way
It's been there for over 10 years
They have.
more, yeah.
okay. So we okay, thank you.
and I
Thank
would
you.
say- I was just going to build on that comment too, in terms of like track record. I think it's not uncommon for a lot of organizations, and as we look to nationally, where there is an interest in, you need to have that on the right, the WEDB, if I can use the acronym, the WEDB, the goal is to be as inclusive as possible, right? Like there's plenty of work to do and people want to see themselves as part of something, but at the end of the day, a smaller group is going to have to do, like Jay said, sort of that, the nitty gritty and the work of taking all of, soliciting and then taking all that feedback and converting it to action. And I think that's something we saw in a lot of other models. I think someone else had a question.
Yeah, Emma?
Thank you. So in model 2 here, I understand, I think I got this right, that the private sector chairs requirement under WIOA. Have that right? Yeah. So I mean, one question I have is there another model out there or another structure that also elevates in some way the public sector? That is a large contingent of our economy still, and I would want to make sure that it has the same attention and it's having the same workforce challenges. And I understand, needing to make sure we're in compliance on the federal level, and I wouldn't want to lose the elevation of the needs of public sector. We've talked a lot about schools, and I mean every sector. So can you just maybe speak to that just briefly around just the balance there between.
I really appreciate that comment. I used to be an educator, and I'm doing work with another state, actually, Kentucky, where we do some inspiration as well. And the challenges of recruiting and retaining employees for the public sector is paramount in most places. And I think in the SOCWED, one of the conversations we had was around making that a distinct sector strategy, saying like, this is the governance of the investment and the priorities, and perhaps like one of the focuses for the regional teams and a strategic priority should be around developing the pipeline long-term, but also figuring some immediate solutions on how to address the challenges for whether it be educators, police, state employees, municipal employees, et cetera. And that's how we wanted to solve for that because it needs to be a unique, like that's a whole set of strategic requirements above and beyond, separate from just the governance of the
Sure.
ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'm a big believer in, the decision makers at the table bring actively that perspective. And if that's not in the room, especially with this executive committee model piece, I think we might be missing some real-time, just insights and information from the field. It just feels like it's a missing piece in this particular model. Just a comment.
Well, I think that will, once we have the language, that's where we start to drill down into what's the composition of the executive board?
Sure.
What's the composition? How are we setting things up with the new state workforce board, that type of thing. So
Okay.
keep that in mind and when we start talking about language, that's the time when we can really dive into who do we want on the executive committee.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on this? Okay.
Okay,
Continue
all
on.
right. On to 3. Oh, okay. I think we talked about this one. Okay. Model 3. Okay. So Model 3 is a little bit different because it is really, I think, getting underneath this question around data and information and understanding what's happening to the people, where and how do you look at, especially looking at cross vertical, whether it's human services, education, or labor investments, how do all of these investments interact in the ecosystem to have an impact for residents and businesses? And so I think, again, to sort of going back to some of my opening comments, we see this could be a standalone model and a starting point, because if you have a data commission, as we looked at some national models, you'll need to have the stakeholders involved in the oversight and the governance of that data. And those stakeholders would be the same as those who are part of the State Workforce Development Board. And so there's an opportunity to bring those two pieces together. So as we look at the features here, and again, these models we present these as modular. And so in the case of this one in Model 3, given the amount of work required to set up a comprehensive data commission, we just suggested keep the Workforce Development Board in VDOL at the time for now. That could be just a choice to move it, could happen later. It could be with clarity from a more integrated data system that the governance is fine staying there. But in any case, regardless, again, you'll see the theme. The emphasis here is also on creating a permanent executive director for the State Workforce Development Board. But also, in addition here, we're suggesting that you set up a data trust, a legal entity to hold, access data from multiple sources, make the decisions about how the data can be used and for what purposes. Here we're drawing heavily on North Dakota, who was able to use their student longitudinal data system and build on top of that additional resources and looking at labor. And now they've created this hub that no matter that they have one look now with their data. I shouldn't say now, it's evolving. But they are able to look at the data, and based on all of those who are contributing, the more that entities are contributing, the richer and the more robust the picture is that they are able to tell about how all of these investments, public or private, are contributing to the state of talent in their state. Obviously, the Agency of Digital Services would probably seems like the most obvious place to have an operational affiliation and management component for the data trust, given that they're already doing that, thinking about compliance around privacy and whatnot. But again, this, as I said at the top, this data governance committee would be comprised of the same leaders and representatives of those contributing and benefiting from the trust, both public and private, so that you could look at all of that in one view. So So look, so this, you know, for this is obviously creating a data trust as a whole entity in and of itself, and probably goes a bit beyond the scope of what we were doing. But, you know, first and foremost, you've got to establish the trust agreement to define what Vermont is looking for in terms of purpose, scope, objectives, terms of operations, really the mechanics of how that goes. And then also the mechanics, but also the rights and the obligations of the data providers and the users and the trustees. You know, there would be a preliminary process to identify the data providers. Obviously, we would, you know, want to recommend probably the internal public resources begin that work. And then you, from there, begin to build out what that process would look like in terms of users and whatnot. But I think, you know, when we heard from the folks from North Dakota, I mean, they're giving real-time feedback, not just to the legislature, but to implementers within government and outside of government to really understand what's happening so that they can make smart programmatic choices about where they put future resources. So, you know, part of why this is included here.
Alicia Stephanie has a question for you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. My question is about that data data trust or data bank. Is that only for this specific purpose in North Dakota? Is it only for this specific purpose, or is it more broad for the entire data collected for the entire?
I would say it's their origin was in education, and that was their first purpose, but now they're able to report back on the continuum of services from K-12 into post-secondary and to general workforce. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so it's those two specific areas. It's not broader.
That's not to say you couldn't do something broader. I would say that, example, drawing on Kentucky, because I have firsthand knowledge of that, you know, they're looking at licensure as part of their data trust and thinking about, again, providing real-time feedback to their stakeholders about how many, you know, licensed plumbers do we have, and creating a cohesive digital, like really integrating all of those systems so that they can have more inputs.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. This. So, you know, I think, so as I was saying, I think the opportunity here is that it is a true informed view on what's happening, and decision makers can get you know, more feedback to make smart choices about how to deploy resources in a more dynamic way. Given that, you know, even over the course of our engagement with the SOCWED, the flooding, all kinds of things, like this is, we're entering a different era from which this workforce system was designed. And there are opportunities with more information. You can, you know, you can make a more responsive system to meet the needs of Vermonters and businesses. So the other thing that we also heard was that doing data work requires a different kind of expertise per se, and that it's hard without scale. Some organizations and pockets don't necessarily have either the data expertise or the technical expertise to do it as effectively as possible, and that by creating this one system, so to speak, you know, it's more scalable, you'll have common rules, you'll be able to do more. You know, but the challenge is this is like a longer term endeavor. It'll take time to really realize the value from all of this data strategy. You know, and that has its limits as well. So, you know, whether it's the human resources to plan and prepare for it, or the financial to implement, there has to be a willingness to give it time to develop before you see the impacts. You know, one of the other challenges is that this puts a lot of it puts a lot on just data, when there are probably other things that could be implemented and changed along the way to yield some improvements and efficiencies that were the original impetus for the SOCWID. So, that's a trade-off in this particular model. So I think just final considerations as we were thinking through as we thought through what we heard, what we saw in other places, and based on our dialogue with the SOCWED, as the committee, we kind of left, these were sort of our concluding thoughts to pass along as you all think about the path forward, was that, stakeholder engagement, especially those who are typically underrepresented, want to ensure that people, organizations see themselves as part of the solution. And that will take, we want to ensure that there's a model where those organizations and people feel like they're part of something, almost like a campaign, if you will. We want to ensure that there's a model that provided transparency, but also resilience to withstand changes in administration, changes in personnel, and that created some redundancies as well, so that it would be a vehicle for moving forward. I think, data clearly is an important piece for whatever gets done next. Continuity, I think, is implied as part of that transparency and resilience, but also funding maximization. Is this a model broad enough that brings and integrates all of the resources together? Because I think one of the things that we heard from those that we interacted with, and there were probably conducted over 100 interviews, there's a lot of enthusiasm and a desire and a community spirit to contribute and be part of the solution. And so, how do you create a model that engages all of those resources to help amplify the opportunities there? So I guess with that, I'll close and I can stop screen sharing, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions or invite others from the SOCWED. If there are other comments, things that I might have left out.
Committee on the report.
So I was looking through, I'm going to try to really synthesize my comments, but I have lots of them going on here in my head. I'm looking through some of the report and realizing that you looked at Utah, maybe one of the other states that had merged departments in order to synthesize the work so that everything was done more efficiently and effectively. And but I don't see a proposal along those lines. And I know that in Vermont, we're looking at smaller budget availability and less funding. And we also know that we need people to play better in the sandbox, right? So I'm curious as to why that wasn't one of the models that was presented.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think a couple of reasons. There are so many things to put in there, and I think Utah is kind of unique in that they made these changes a while back. And it's taken them many years, and over time they've added more and more departments. So I think we included that as one of the three that we featured on the front end in many respects as inspiration, but that it also would take a lot of reorganization. And one of the things that we heard was that, there's been such flux in the workforce and the public workforce, the state workforce, that is, and that there are just challenges right now to implement the day-to-day, and that this might be too much of a wholesale change to take on at once. And I do think with some of the models, there's opportunity to that was model 2, I think would allow for some of that piloting. And so I think that's a kind of like a nice neutral starting place, because you could say, okay, we have this committee. What if education and human services, what if you start blending that single point of entry for young people and you pilot that? And that's an attempt. You could start braiding resources at a smaller scale.
I was more thinking ACCD and Department of Labor, but which is our purview, right? Like that's, and workforce, right? Like that's really, those are the two departments that really need to work well together to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, and there's no reason why those departments can't start with a pilot of some kind and start seeing what those collaborations are like. You could also utilize a regional like RFP grant program to put it out to some regions. And you could say like, why don't we pilot this idea in a region where there is already energy and alignment and stability, and test it. You could test it there. It just seemed like too much of a radical move at this point in time. But I do think in Model 2, there is a structure there that would enable some of these ideas that you're referring to around the collaboration and intersection of the interests of those two departments.
Thank you.
And I think also that's where, you know, the discussion that we're having of creating this director of workforce expansion and development with the tie directly to the governor can bring those ties to tying in ACCD along with DOL, along with AHS, along with, you know, wherever in state government we have workforce, either federal government, federal dollars coming in, and also working with human resources within state government of everybody trying to work together. And so I think, you know, our thought when we put this in legislation was that we need that direct connection to the government. So I think that's an attempt to not get into trying to merge an agency and a commission and a department together. We kind of went down that road a number of years ago. It wasn't well received. So this is another attempt to have that one person be the facilitator and a collaborator to bring people together. So I think it's less radical and I think we'll see if this works or not. Jay or Adam, did you want to weigh in?
I would say that it was the committee had consensus that we wanted to work from a place where we thought there would be broad support, and that tackling that size of a merger would not be an effective use of our time at this point, and find an alternative way that Chair Marcotte just described.
I agree, and I think we were trying to also codify a part of the structure that exists currently with an executive director position, but it's not defined in statute. And so I think we're thinking if we can have a codified position in statute that then has the responsibility on a full-time basis of coordinating across the intergovernmental partners and the external partners and private philanthropy, that will be able to bring about some change, plus having a smaller board that is focused on primarily WIOA, but the workforce expansion efforts. And I think what's not stated in the report is a discussion that we had about regional teams and an interaction with workforce expansion positions that were allocated to the Department of Labor that we're seeing as an important part of this change in the system.
Any other questions? Anything else, Jay or Adam, that you want to add to just the overall report?
I just would add about the data trust. I think we received a presentation from Nebraska where they were able to, they shared their sort of website, and it's a tool for helping the state and training partners to identify where are the gaps in training, which is an area that we're all interested in. Where should training be developed? What sectors are missing trainings? And that having that information, even though we're not going to have it next year or in 2 years, but being able to analyze all of our workforce programs systemically will help us invest more wisely in targeted areas where we know, we suspect we know training is needed, or there's not coverage for something. So I think it's an important piece to know that other states are doing this. We should be doing it too. But as Alicia said, it will take time.
I would just say how excited I am for the receipt of this report, for the future opportunity that it's really articulating. We know we've been heading in this direction for so long. A lot of these things we sort of intuitively knew, but this report and the research has helped really identify best practices across the country. Similar states to Vermont with the lack of density and rural nature, single state boards. So it's brought us a lot of knowledge and expertise to help us inform exactly how to make this work here in Vermont. So I think, we're going to be coming back to this committee at a future point and look forward to a sort of deeper level conversation about all of the things the SOCWED committee has been exploring in this report.
I think so. What we'll see is, this is a report that we received from PCG that's been informing the SOCWED. So the report from the SOCWED will actually be the legislation that we're developing. So H707 is not, that's the vehicle. It's not the proposal that we will be putting on the table. So we're continuing to work on that together. We're hoping that next Thursday we'll be able to present something to the committee where we'll bring all members of the SOCWED back to continue that discussion. But I think you're going to see pieces of all three recommendations that we received from PCG has the starting point where we had that discussion between the SOCWED and this committee. I want to take the opportunity to thank Alicia, PCG. Great working with PCG and working with you, Alicia, and your team. I think, we received a lot of good information, very good working relationship with PCG and with you. So we certainly appreciate all your work and appreciate working with you and your team. And I want to say, the SOCWED as well, I think we did a pretty good job of understanding who we needed on the SOCWED team. We had, members from the House and the Senate. We had a member from, right under the governor's administration, along with the Department of Labor. And we had, our outside private sector, with Adam being the State Workforce Development Chairman. So we worked well together, and we weren't afraid to, I don't think anyone was afraid to bring up different ideas and have those discussions. There was a lot of discussion going on. So, I want to thank, Kendall and Jay, Adam, Senator Clarkson, for all of their work as well. And Amanda Wheeler, she helped staff, and also, being the interim executive director of the State Workforce Development Board as well. So Commissioner Harrington and Cameron were very essential. Ellen Kaler as well was in and chatting with us too. So there's been a lot of interest in this endeavor, and I think we'll see some. We'll be able to work on this starting next week. It'll be our priority to get this through before crossover, so that we can get it down to Senate Economic Development. But I think we're on a really good path to hopefully solving the issues that we've identified over the years, and to go where we want to go.
I just want to say thank you to Chair Marcotte and the rest of the SOCWED team. These are the kinds of projects that are just so exciting to be a part of, and really appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you and to get an even greater appreciation for all that happens in Vermont. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything else, committee? Okay. So, again, thanks Alicia for joining us today, and Jay and Adam, thanks for joining us, and we'll continue to chat. We develop the language. So I think we're done for the morning. We're back at 1. We have Representative Brumstead coming in to chat with us about GAC, and then we'll be working with Rick on the letter to appropriations. Maria will come in and we'll go have another vote on the captive bill along with the amendments to it. While we're on record, Kirk, would you like to vote on the
Yes.
miscellaneous changes to corrections to the worker comp bill?
Yes, I believe yes.
You vote Kirk. Okay. So then White votes yes.
Okay.